Eleanor visited her sister every Thursday, without fail, without exception. But on the sixth visit, she walked in wearing a veil, inside on a warm afternoon. Clara lifted it herself, and what she saw on her sister's face told her everything that 4 months of letters had carefully hidden. Clara stood up, walked to the window, stood there without speaking. When she turned back around, her face was completely calm. Eleanor knew that calm. She had seen it once before, the night Clara put a man in hospital for putting his hands on her. Clara sat down, took both her hands, and said,
"Next Thursday, you are not leaving this place. I am going in your place. Clara, he will kill you."
Clara looked at her sister's face, at the veil in her hands, at 4 months of silence sitting on her sister's skin. She said,
"He married a quiet, broken woman who would not fight back. He will have no idea that woman is sitting right here."
And the one walking through his door on Thursday morning stepped out of that carriage and walked straight into the fire. A carriage arrived at his gates, and his wife stepped out. Same face, same dress, same hair, but something was different. He could not name it, he could not place it. It sat at the back of his mind like a splinter he could not reach. That evening at dinner, his mother made her usual remarks. The woman smiled, not Eleanor's smile, something else entirely. Something that made Lady Ashford stop mid-sentence. That night, he called her to his study. He looked at her face for a long time. She looked back at him, perfectly still, perfectly calm. And Edmund Ashford, a man who had never once in his life been afraid of his own wife, felt something he could not explain. He did not know yet that the woman sitting across from him was not his wife. He did not know that the real Eleanor was sitting safely miles away, and he had absolutely no idea that the woman in front of him had spent 3 years locked in a building, specifically because the last man who hurt her sister made that mistake. He thought he had a quiet wife. He had a loaded gun, and she was already pointing it at everything he had ever built. Welcome to Duke and Duchess. Subscribe now, because what this woman does next will shock you completely. The Voss family estate sat on the edge of a quiet English village, like a man who had once been wealthy and was now simply trying to maintain his dignity. The house was large enough to impress strangers and old enough to require constant repair. The gardens were beautiful in summer and expensive all year round. The stables held 4 horses that Lord Voss could no longer comfortably afford to feed, but could not bring himself to sell, because some things a man holds on to even when reason tells him to let go. Lord Voss was that kind of man. He was good, genuinely good in the rare, uncomplicated way that some people are good, without performance, without agenda, without the particular calculation that dresses itself up as kindness in people who are neither. He had loved his wife completely and lost her to fever when the twins were 7 years old, and had spent the following years raising 2 daughters alone with the quiet determination of a man who understood that the most important thing he could leave them was not money or position, but character. He largely succeeded. Eleanor Voss was 18 years old and everything her father had hoped she would be. She was patient, thoughtful, perceptive in the deep, quiet way of people who listen more than they speak. She had her mother's face and her father's steadiness, and a gentleness about her that was not weakness, though people who did not know her well made that mistake constantly. Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing at all times. She simply chose kindness so consistently and so naturally that people forgot it was a choice. She was the twin who made people feel safe. Clara Voss was 18 years old and a completely different weather system. She had the same face as Eleanor, exactly the same. Same dark eyes, same sharp jaw, same dark hair that curled at the ends in damp weather. But where Eleanor's eyes held things quietly, Clara's eyes said everything immediately and without apology. She felt the world at full volume. Joy, anger, love, injustice, all of it arrived in Clara at complete intensity and departed through her mouth or her hands before whatever filter society had attempted to install could do anything about it. She was the twin who made people feel seen, which was considerably more uncomfortable for most of them. They were inseparable in the way that people are inseparable when they have been each other's only constant since childhood. They argued constantly. They understood each other completely. They could communicate across a room with a single look in a private language that 19 years of shared life had built between them without either of them noticing it was being built. The house they grew up in was warm, despite the crumbling edges of it. Lord Voss read to them in the evenings. They ate together every meal. The cook, Mrs. Howell, had been with the family since before the girls were born and treated them both with the particular combination of love and zero tolerance for nonsense that is the exclusive province of women who have raised children that are not technically theirs. But underneath the warmth, Lord Voss carried a weight his daughters could both feel even when he hid it most successfully. The debts had been building for years. Not from recklessness, from the particular slow erosion of a modest estate that requires more to maintain than it produces, repairs that could not be postponed, a harvest that failed 2 years running, obligations to tenant families that Lord Voss would not abandon even when meeting them cost him money he did not have. Eleanor knew about the deaths. She had found the ledgers at 15 and said nothing to anyone, including Clara, because she understood that some knowledge is a burden you carry alone when carrying it together would only double the weight. Clara did not know the full extent, but Clara felt everything in the house whether she was told about it or not, and she had known for years that something underneath their life was not solid. She simply had not known yet what was coming to use it. That was about to change. Sir William Beckett arrived in their county in the spring and immediately identified Eleanor Voss as exactly what he was looking for. He was 26, lean and well-dressed, with an easy smile and the particular social confidence of a man who had never been seriously refused anything he wanted. He came from a family with enough money to smooth over most of his rougher edges in public, and enough influence to ensure that the edges nobody was supposed to see stayed invisible. He pursued Eleanor with flowers and letters and carefully timed visits that arrived when Lord Voss was present and therefore appeared entirely respectable. He was charming at dinner. He asked Eleanor questions and listened to her answers with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested. Eleanor was cautious. She was not a naive girl, but she was also 18 and had not yet encountered a specific type of man whose charm is a tool rather than a quality, and she found herself, carefully, guardedly, beginning to consider him. Clara did not consider him for a single second. She watched William Beckett across the dinner table on his third visit with the focused attention of someone identifying a problem they have not yet worked out how to solve. She said nothing at dinner. Afterward, she told Eleanor directly that something was wrong with him, that the charm was too consistent, that he listened too perfectly, that he never said anything real. Eleanor said Clara was being unfair. Clara said Eleanor was being hopeful, which was different from being right. They argued about it for 3 weeks. On the 4th week, William Beckett arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Lord Voss was away at a neighboring estate and Clara had ridden out to the village. He had known both of these things before he arrived. He had been paying attention to the household schedule with the particular thoroughness of a man who plans carefully. He found Eleanor in the walled garden cutting roses. What happened in that garden in the following 20 minutes was something Eleanor never described fully to anyone in her life. She described the beginning, William Beckett walking through the garden gate. She described the end, herself on the stone bench, unable to move. She never described what happened in between. She did not need to. Clara came home an hour later. She found her sister on the bench, the roses on the ground, the sleeve torn at the shoulder, Eleanor's face completely white, and her hands shaking in her lap, and her eyes fixed on something in the middle distance that was not the garden. Clara stood in the garden doorway for 3 seconds. Then she turned around and walked back out. She found William Beckett at the Crown Inn in the village, having supper with 2 friends. He was laughing at something when she walked in. She crossed the room without stopping and without a word, and what followed lasted approximately 4 minutes and resulted in William Beckett requiring 2 weeks of medical attention and 3 of his teeth requiring the attention of a different kind of professional entirely. Clara did not run. She walked home. She went to Eleanor. She sat with her sister all night without sleeping. In the morning, the county had already decided what had happened. Not the truth. The county had decided that Clara Voss had attacked an innocent man without provocation at a public inn in front of witnesses, and that she was dangerous and unstable and needed to be removed from society for everyone's protection. William Beckett did not press charges. He did not need to. The machinery of consequence for women who defended themselves was already moving without him. A magistrate came. A doctor came. The doctor spent 40 minutes with Clara, 40 minutes during which Clara, who was exhausted and furious and raw from the previous night, was not at her most measured, and signed a paper that said she was a danger to herself and others. 2 men came to take her to Ashwood House. Clara fought them at the door. Eleanor stood in the hallway screaming her sister's name. Lord Voss stood with his hands over his face because he had tried everything he had and it was not enough, and he knew it was not enough, and that knowledge was destroying him in real time. The carriage door closed. Eleanor ran after it down the drive, barefoot on the gravel, screaming Clara's name until the carriage disappeared. And then she stood in the drive, alone in the silence and the stillness, and understood that she was now in this world without the one person who had always stood between her and the worst of it. She was alone, and somewhere in England a man named William Beckett was sleeping perfectly well. The years without Clara changed Eleanor in ways she could feel but not fully name. She visited Ashwood House every Thursday without exception, every single Thursday for 3 years, regardless of weather or cost or the state of the family finances, which continued to deteriorate with the patient inevitability of a house built on ground that was slowly giving way. Ashwood House was a cold building, with long stone corridors and small windows that let in light reluctantly, as though it too had decided the people inside did not deserve much of it. The visiting room smelled of damp and carbolic soap. The chairs were hard. The attendant who supervised visits sat in the corner with the bored authority of someone who considered their presence a generosity. Eleanor brought food every week, real food, things Clara liked. She brought books and newspapers and any small item she could find that might make the room Clara lived in feel less like what it was. Clara always appeared for visits looking fiercer than the week before. Not broken, never broken, but sharpened, refined in the way that difficult conditions refine people who refuse to be destroyed by them. She asked Eleanor questions about the outside world with an intensity that Eleanor found both comforting and slightly frightening. Clara was preparing for something. Eleanor could feel it. She did not ask what. She simply brought the food and the books and answered every question and held her sister's hand and went home and fell apart privately so that Clara never had to see it. At home, Eleanor managed everything: the estate, the accounts, her father whose health was declining in ways he minimized and she observed, the household staff who needed direction and wages that were increasingly difficult to guarantee. She did all of it without complaint, without asking for acknowledgement, without allowing anyone to see how close to the edge she was. Lord Voss called her to his study on a Tuesday morning in January. She knew from the way he called her that it was serious. He used her full name. He only used her full name when what he was about to say required the weight of it. He showed her the letter from Edmund Ashford. She read it carefully from beginning to end. Then she set it on the desk and looked at her father. He looked back at her with the eyes of a man who is ashamed of what he is asking and has not found a way to stop himself asking it. "Tell me the truth, Father," she said. "Is there truly no other way?" He was quiet for a long time. "I have exhausted every other way," he said. "I have been exhausting them for 2 years without telling you because I did not want this to be your burden. It has become your burden anyway, and I am sorrier for that than I know how to say." Eleanor looked at the letter again. Edmund Ashford, the dupe of Harrow, 38 years old, one of the wealthiest men in England, a man whose first wife had died at 32 under circumstances that were officially recorded as fever and unofficially whispered about in every drawing room in the county. She asked her father one question: "If I refuse, what happens to this family?" Her father looked at his desk. That was her answer. She went to Ashwood House the following Thursday and told Clara. Clara listened without speaking, which was the most frightening thing about the conversation, because Clara never listened without speaking. When Eleanor finished, Clara was quiet for a long time. She sat with her hands flat on the table, looking at something that was not in the room. Then she said, "Tell me everything you can find out about Edmund Ashford. Everything. His habits, his household, his family, the names of his staff, the layout of his estate. Everything." Eleanor stared at her. Why? Clara looked at her sister. "Because you are not going in there alone," she said. Eleanor married Edmund Ashford on a gray Wednesday morning 6 weeks later. She wore their mother's dress, altered to fit. Lord Voss walked her to the church door and held her hand for a long moment before he let go, and she understood that he was letting go of more than her hand. The carriage took her to Harrow Hall. The great doors closed behind her, and Eleanor Voss became the Duchess of Harrow and began the most difficult performance of her life, pretending that she was not afraid.
Eleanor understood within the first week that Harrow Hall was not a house, it was a system. Every person in it occupied a precise position in a hierarchy that Edmund controlled completely and maintained through the particular combination of cold authority and unpredictable response that keeps people permanently off balance. The staff moved quickly and quietly with their eyes down, not because they were well trained, but because they had learned that being noticed by Edmund Ashford was rarely a good thing. The house itself was grand and cold, high ceilings that held the warmth badly, stone floors that echoed every footstep, fires that were built in the main rooms for appearances and allowed to die down the moment Edmund left. Eleanor's bedroom was large and formally furnished, and had the quality of a room that had been designed to impress guests and had never been intended for actual comfort. Edmund came to her room 3 times in the first month. He said nothing on any of these occasions beyond what was functionally necessary. He did not ask how she was. He did not learn what she liked or disliked. He treated her with the detached efficiency of a man completing an obligation and left without looking back. Eleanor lay in the dark afterward and breathed carefully and methodically and told herself she had survived worse and would survive this. Lady Ashford established her position on the first morning. She appeared at breakfast already seated at the head of the table, Eleanor's place as Duchess, and looked up when Eleanor entered the room with the expression of a woman who has decided that the new arrival is a temporary inconvenience that will eventually be managed. "You are 4 minutes late," she said. "I apologize," Eleanor said quietly. "I did not know the household breakfast time." "You should have asked," Lady Ashford said. "A Duchess of Harrow is never late and never uninformed." She said this in front of 3 members of staff who looked at their hands. Eleanor sat at the remaining place at the table, not the head, not beside Edmund, at the side, and ate her breakfast in silence, while Lady Ashford conducted a monologue about the proper management of a household that was addressed to the room generally and aimed at Eleanor specifically. This happened every morning. The comments were never identical, but they were always precise. Lady Ashford had the gift of identifying the exact point of a person's uncertainty and pressing on it repeatedly with the delicate consistency of someone who understands that small wounds applied daily are more effective than large ones applied occasionally. Eleanor's dress was always slightly wrong. Her conversation at dinner was always slightly too quiet or slightly too forward. Her management of the household staff showed her common origins. Her posture at the piano lacked the refinement of a woman properly educated. Her letters were too short or too long, or insufficiently formal or insufficiently warm. Eleanor absorbed every comment with the still composure that she had been practicing since childhood, and said nothing. Constance and Beatrice arrived for their first monthly visit in March. They were Edmund's sisters. Constance was 35, sharp-eyed and deliberate, the kind of woman who decides her opinion of you in the first 5 minutes and rarely revises it. Beatrice was 32, less sharp than Constance, but equally unwelcoming in the particular way of someone following a lead they have not examined critically. They arrived together and greeted Lady Ashford with the warm performance of daughters who visit out of obligation and have learned to make it look like affection. They greeted Eleanor with the cool courtesy of women who have decided the new wife is not worth real warmth. At dinner that first evening, Constance looked at Eleanor across the table and said with a pleasant smile, "Edmund tells us you come from a modest estate in the north. How lovely that you have managed to find your way here." The table was quiet. Eleanor looked at Constance. "How lovely indeed," she said softly. Constance smiled and moved to the next subject, and Eleanor understood completely that she had just been placed and that Constance intended to keep her in that place. Edmund hit her for the first time on a Thursday evening in April. It was not preceded by an argument. There was no escalation. He came into the sitting room where she was writing a letter and told her that he had heard from Lady Ashford that she had contradicted her on a household matter in front of the cook that afternoon. Eleanor had asked the cook to add a specific dish to the weekly menu. Lady Ashford had countermanded the instruction. Eleanor had quietly restated her own preference. This had been reported to Edmund within the hour. She began to explain. He crossed the room and struck her across the face with a flat, open hand. Not a punch, not frenzied, deliberate, controlled. The act of a man who has done this before and considers it a reasonable management tool. Eleanor stood completely still afterward. Edmund straightened his jacket. "You do not contradict my mother in front of staff. You do not contradict my mother at all. This house ran perfectly well before you arrived, and it will continue to do so. Your function here is clearly understood by everyone, including yourself. Do not require me to explain it again." He left the room. Eleanor stood alone in the sitting room until she was certain she could walk with her legs shaking. Then she went to her bedroom, locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed. She did not cry. She wrote to Clara the next morning, about the garden, about the weather, about nothing that mattered. She covered the mark on her face with powder and went down to breakfast 4 minutes early.
Clara knew something was wrong before Eleanor said a single word about it. She knew it the way she had always known things about her sister. Not through information, but through the particular frequency of attention that 19 years of watching the same person builds into you, whether you intend it or not. Eleanor visited every Thursday, as she always had. She came with food and books and news from outside, and she sat across the table and smiled, and said the house was grand, and Edmund was formal, and Lady Ashford was difficult but manageable. Clara watched her sister's face while she said these things. She watched the face, and she watched the hands, and she watched the posture, and what she saw did not match what she heard. Eleanor had always held herself with a natural upright ease that was simply part of how she occupied space. The woman sitting across from her now held herself differently, carefully, with a controlled precision that looked like composure but was actually something else. It was the way a person holds themselves when they have learned that moving wrong has consequences. Clara said nothing on the first visit, said nothing on the second. On the third visit, she watched Eleanor reach for a cup of tea, and the sleeve of her dress slipped back slightly at the wrist, and Clara saw the edge of something dark on the inside of her forearm before Eleanor pulled it down again with a movement so practiced it was almost invisible. Clara felt something go completely cold inside her chest. She said nothing. She smiled. She asked about the garden. She listened to Eleanor describe the Harrow Hall kitchen garden with the careful brightness of someone who has prepared topics of conversation specifically to fill silences safely. On the fourth visit, Eleanor came in wearing long sleeves, despite the room being warm. On the fifth visit, she kept her left hand in her lap the entire time. On the sixth visit, she came in wearing a veil over her face, inside, in a closed visiting room on a day that was not cold. Clara looked at her sister sitting across the table with a veil covering her face, and the coldness that had started 3 visits ago spread through her entire body and became something else. Not anger, not yet. Something beneath anger. Something that had weight and direction and patience in it. "Take it off," Clara said quietly. "It is simply a fashion." "Eleanor." Silence. "Take it off." A long moment. Eleanor reached up slowly and lifted the veil. Clara looked at her sister's face. She looked at it for a long time without speaking or moving. Then she stood up and walked to the window and stood with her back to the room. She stood there looking out at the gray moors for a long time. She was breathing slowly and deliberately, and she was doing the thing she had spent 3 years learning to do inside this building. Taking the loudest, most explosive feeling and pressing it down into something dense and controlled and purposeful. When she turned back around, her face was completely still. She sat down. She took both of Eleanor's hands in hers. She looked directly into her sister's eyes. "How long?" she said. "Clara, please." "How long, Eleanor?" Eleanor looked at their joined hands. "Since the 2nd month." "Not just him." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "His mother, every day. His sisters when they visit. It is not the same as Edmund, but it is—" She stopped. "Constant." Eleanor nodded. Clara held her sister's hands and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "Next Thursday you are coming here and you are staying, and I am leaving in your place." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Absolutely not. We are identical. He has seen your face for 4 months. He does not look at you the way people look at someone they are genuinely seeing. He looks at you the way men like that look at furniture. He sees what he expects to see." "Clara, if he finds out—" "He will not find out," Clara said. "Not before I am finished." "What are you going to do?" Clara looked at her sister's face, at the veil still in Eleanor's hand, at the wrist she was holding. "I am going to go in there," she said quietly, "and I am going to experience exactly what you experienced, and I am going to watch everything, and I am going to find every secret in that house and every crack in every wall, and then I am going to use all of it." "You cannot fight them, Clara." "I am not going to fight them. I am going to be smarter than them, which is considerably more damaging and considerably harder to recover from." Eleanor looked at her twin. "You went in loud last time," she said carefully. "I know. This time I'm going in quiet." She squeezed Eleanor's hands once. "Trust me," she said. Eleanor looked at her sister for a long time. "I have always trusted you, even when you broke 3 of William Beckett's fingers." "I maintain that was completely justified," Clara said. For the first time in months, Eleanor almost smiled. Clara walked out of Ashwood House on a Thursday morning wearing Eleanor's clothes. Eleanor's green traveling dress. Eleanor's gray coat. Eleanor's shoes that were half a size too small and that Clara did not mention because the discomfort was useful. It kept her focused and grounded and present in a way that nothing purely mental could achieve. The carriage driver did not look twice. He had been collecting the Duchess every Thursday for 4 months. Same face, same coat, same quiet manner. He helped her into the carriage and climbed to his seat, and they moved off down the road, and Clara sat inside with her hands folded in her lap and spent the entire journey doing something she had never done before in her life. She practiced being still. Not physically still, mentally still. She went through everything Eleanor had told her about Harrow Hall. The layout, the names, the routines, Edmund's habits, Lady Ashford's particular methods, Constance's sharpness, Beatrice's followership. She organized it all into a structure she could navigate. She arrived at Harrow Hall at 4:30 in the afternoon. Edmund was in the entrance hall. He looked at her with the flat, assessing look she had been told about and said nothing, and turned and walked away. Clara watched him go. She stored 3 things immediately. The way he moved, with the particular ease of a man who has never had to consider whether his presence was wanted. The way the footman near the door stepped back slightly when Edmund passed, not out of deference, but out of avoidance. And the way the entrance hall itself felt, grand, cold, and completely without warmth despite the fire burning at the far end. She understood in 30 seconds exactly what Eleanor had been living in. Lady Ashford descended the main staircase with the timing of a woman who had been watching from the landing. She stopped in front of Clara and looked at her face with the close attention she had apparently applied every time Eleanor came through the door. Clara held perfectly still. She kept her eyes at the level Eleanor kept them, slightly soft, slightly careful, not quite meeting directly. She kept her face open and undefended in a way that cost her more effort than anything else she had done that day. Lady Ashford's eyes moved across her face. Something flickered, not recognition, something more like a question that did not yet have enough information to form fully. "You are late," Lady Ashford said. "I apologize," said Clara in Eleanor's voice. Soft, careful. Lady Ashford held the look for 1 second longer than was comfortable. Then she turned. "Dinner at 7. Do not be late for that as well." She walked away. Clara stood in the entrance hall alone and let out a breath so controlled it was invisible. Dinner the first evening taught Clara everything she needed to know about the daily mechanics of Eleanor's suffering. Lady Ashford began before the soup was finished. The comment about the dress, then the comment about how Eleanor was holding her spoon, then a remark about the household accounts delivered to Edmund as though Eleanor were not present, that managed to imply incompetence without using the word. Each comment landed in the room and was absorbed by the other occupants, Edmund without reaction, the footman without expression, in the practiced way of people who have sat through this enough times to have learned their role in it. Clara sat through it with her hands folded and her face soft, and Eleanor's composure fitted over her own instincts like a coat over something with teeth. The 3rd comment she let pass. The 4th comment she let pass. The 5th comment, something about the flower arrangement on the table being poorly chosen, which was delivered with a particular sweetness that made it somehow worse than directness. Clara lifted her eyes very briefly to Lady Ashford's face. Not Clara's eyes, not the full, direct look that would have identified her immediately, just a half-second of something that was not quite Eleanor's softness. Lady Ashford paused almost imperceptibly, then continued. Clara looked back at her plate. She had almost broken on the 5th comment. She filed this information carefully. Eleanor had been absorbing this every single day for 4 months without breaking once. The full weight of what that cost landed on Clara in that moment more completely than anything Eleanor had described. She sat with it. She used it. She would need every bit of it when the time came. After dinner, Edmund called her to his study. He told her that Lady Ashford had informed him that the household flower arrangement had been changed from its usual arrangement that morning. Clara looked at him with Eleanor's soft, careful eyes. "I thought a change might be pleasant," she said quietly. "Lady Ashford manages the household aesthetics. That is not your domain." "I understand," she said. "I apologize." He looked at her for a moment with the flat assessment. "See that it is not repeated," he said. Clara nodded, turned to leave. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the particular focused look she had been warned about, the look that meant he was not quite satisfied with what he was seeing, but could not identify the specific problem. "Are you quite well?" he said. "I am tired from the journey. I will be better tomorrow." He held the look for 3 more seconds, then he waved his hand in dismissal. Clara walked out of the study and down the corridor and into the room that was Eleanor's room, and closed the door and stood with her back against it and breathed. She looked at the room, at the cold, formal furniture, at the window looking out over the dark estate, at the small, worn patch on the corner of the hearthrug where Eleanor had apparently sat often enough to leave a mark. She crossed the room and sat in that exact spot. She looked at the fire and she let herself feel everything she had been compressing all evening. The anger, the grief for what Eleanor had endured, the cold fury at what this house was and what it had done. She sat with it all for exactly 10 minutes. Then she stood up. She was not here to feel things. She was here to end them.
Clara spent the first 2 weeks doing almost nothing visible. She attended breakfast and dinner. She managed the household interactions with Eleanor's quiet composure. She endured Lady Ashford's daily commentary without visible response. She answered Edmund's occasional questions with careful brevity. She was present and cooperative and entirely unremarkable. And she watched everything. She watched the way the household staff moved differently depending on who was in the room. The cook, Mrs. Dunmore, who had been at Harrow Hall for 20 years and whose eyes held a history that her careful professional face did not reveal. The lady's maid, Agnes, who had been Eleanor's maid and who performed her duties with a precision that was also a kind of protection, staying close, anticipating needs, minimizing the number of interactions between Eleanor and the danger zones of the house. Clara noticed Agnes on the 3rd day and adjusted her treatment of her immediately. She was not performing Eleanor's relationship with Agnes. She was building her own, quietly, through small, consistent gestures of genuine consideration that Agnes noticed and did not comment on, but responded to in the way that careful people respond to unexpected kindness, with a watchful gratitude that would become useful later. She watched Edmund. She needed to understand him completely before she touched him. She watched him at dinner and at breakfast, and in the brief corridor interactions that constituted most of their daily contact. She watched him with his mother, the particular dynamic there that she had sensed on the first evening and was slowly mapping more precisely. Lady Ashford was careful around her son, not in the way of a woman who respects authority, in the way of a woman who fears specific knowledge that someone else holds. Edmund had something on his mother. Clara was certain of this by the end of the first week. The question was what? She watched the sisters. Constance arrived for her monthly visit on a Thursday, and the first thing she did on entering Harrow Hall was look at Clara with those sharp, assessing eyes. Constance had clearly been paying attention to Eleanor and had developed a calibrated sense of how Eleanor moved and spoke and responded. She was testing against that calibration. Clara passed the first evening by being slightly more tired and quieter than usual, which was entirely plausible and gave her cover for any small deviations from Eleanor's specific patterns. But Constance kept watching. On the second evening, Constance asked Eleanor to play the piano after dinner. Eleanor went still for a fraction of a second. Eleanor had mentioned piano lessons as a child, but had not mentioned her current proficiency. Clara did not know how well Eleanor played. She did not know the specific pieces Eleanor typically played at Harrow Hall. She did not know if Eleanor played confidently or hesitantly or with any particular style. She looked at the piano for a moment. Then she sat down and played a simple piece slowly. She played it competently, but without any particular flourish or confidence. She played like someone whose hands were not quite themselves that evening. When she finished, Constance said, "You played that differently than last month." "My hands have been stiff," Clara said, without turning from the keys. "The cold weather." "It is not cold," Constance said. "I feel it more than I used to," Clara said. She turned from the piano with Eleanor's soft, direct look.
Constance held her gaze for a moment. Then Lady Ashford redirected the conversation, and the moment passed. But Clara could feel Constance storing it. She needed to move faster. The letters came to her by accident. She was returning from the East Corridor on a Friday morning when Lady Ashford's maid, Iris, came rushing around the corner and dropped the bundle of correspondence she was carrying. Letters scattered across the stone floor. Clara crouched and helped gather them without looking at them directly, except for one envelope that landed face up within her direct line of sight. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it for exactly the 2 seconds it took to read the name on the outside and the return address. Then she picked it up and handed it to Iris without expression. Iris took them and hurried away. Clara walked back to her room and sat at the writing desk and thought about what she had seen. The name on the envelope was not Edmund's name. It was not a family name. It was a name she did not recognize, a Mr. Geoffrey Harland with an address in Bath, a personal correspondence, delivered to Lady Ashford's private rooms rather than the main household post. She needed to know more. She spent the next 3 days finding a reason to be in the library alone for extended periods. She was establishing the household accounts, which gave her legitimate access to the estate records that Edmund kept on the library shelves with the arrogant confidence of a man who does not believe anyone in his household would dare to look. On the 3rd day, she found what she was looking for. The estate records showed that Harrow Hall's primary estate had originally been left equally between Edmund and his mother by the late Duke, but the current holdings were entirely in Edmund's name. Lady Ashford held nothing. The transfer happened 7 years ago. 7 years ago, Edmund was 31 years old. Lady Ashford would have been in her late 50s, old enough to know exactly what she was signing, which meant she had not signed it freely, which meant Edmund had made her sign it, which meant he had something she was more afraid of losing than her estate. Clara sat in the library and put it all together slowly. Mr. Geoffrey Harland in Bath, 12 years of private correspondence delivered to Lady Ashford's rooms, a woman who signed away her financial independence 7 years ago under circumstances that did not look voluntary, a son who held absolute authority over everyone in his family and maintained it through something other than affection. Clara understood what Lady Ashford's secret was. She understood it completely, and she understood exactly how to use it.
Edmund called Clara to his study at the end of the 2nd week. She had been expecting it. She had watched him watching her all week with increasing frequency, the slightly longer looks at dinner, the pause in conversation when she entered a room, the particular stillness that came over him sometimes that she recognized as a man trying to identify something his instincts were telling him was wrong. He had not found it yet, but he was close. She entered the study and sat across from his desk and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with Eleanor's eyes and waited. He said nothing for a long time. He let the silence sit and expand the way he always did, using it as a tool to make people fill it and expose themselves. Clara let it sit. She looked at him with a mild, patient expression and waited and gave him absolutely nothing to read. His jaw tightened. "You have been different," he said finally. "Different? Since you returned from visiting your sister last Thursday, something is different about you." Clara let a slight confusion move across her face. "I have not been sleeping well," she said softly. "The visits to Ashwood always distress me. Seeing Clara in that place," she let her voice drop, "it takes me several days to recover myself. I am sorry if it has shown in my conduct." "It has shown," Edmund said. "I will do better," Clara said. Edmund looked at her with the flat, assessing look. "You have been speaking to the staff more than is customary," he said. "I have been trying to understand the household better," Clara said. "You have told me that my household management is insufficient. I have been attempting to correct that." "My mother manages this household." "Then I have been attempting to understand how to support her better," Clara said, without a pause. Edmund held the look. Clara held it back. Not directly, not Clara's look,
Eleanor's look, soft and slightly wounded, and with just enough genuine uncertainty in it to be believable. "See that your visits to your sister do not continue to affect your conduct here," he said finally. "Of course," Clara said. She stood to leave. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. Her heart was steady. She had learned to keep it steady. He looked at her face for a long time, really looked, the look of a man trying to find something he could sense but not locate. "Nothing," he said. She nodded once and walked out. She kept her pace exactly right, Eleanor's pace, unhurried, contained, all the way down the corridor and around the corner and into the small sitting room that was rarely used and where she was certain to be alone. She stood in the middle of the room and pressed her hands flat against the sides of her legs and breathed. That had been the closest moment yet. She needed to move. Constance almost caught her on the Tuesday of the third week. It happened over something small. Constance had arrived 2 days before her scheduled visit, unannounced, which was itself unusual enough that Clara noted it immediately as deliberate. Constance had been in the morning room when Clara came downstairs. She watched Clara cross the entrance hall from the morning room doorway with the focused attention of a woman who had been waiting specifically for this moment. "Eleanor," she said. Clara turned. "Come and sit with me," Constance said. They sat in the morning room with tea. Constance poured. She talked about inconsequential things for several minutes with the pleasant ease of a woman who is waiting for something and is very patient about waiting for it. Then she said, "Do you remember the conversation we had last month about Edmund's first wife?" Clara did not move. Eleanor had mentioned Margaret, Edmund's first wife, but only in passing. She had not told Clara the specifics of any conversation she and Constance had shared about her. "I remember you mentioned her," Clara said carefully. "Constance, I told you something specific, about the last year of her life. Do you remember what I told you?" This was a direct trap with no available escape route. Clara looked at Constance steadily. "Constance," she said quietly, "I have to be honest with you. Edmund has been difficult recently. There are days when I find that conversations do not stay with me the way they should. I think the anxiety of it affects my memory." She let that sit. Constance looked at her. "What do you mean, difficult?" And just like that, the direction of the conversation shifted entirely, because Constance had a history with difficult Edmund too, and that history had its own momentum. Clara had redirected without answering the question, but she could see in Constance's face that she had not fully satisfied her either. Constance knew something was wrong. She had not yet assembled what she knew into a conclusion, but she was close. Clara had 1 more week before Constance arrived at that conclusion. She needed to act now.
Clara went to Lady Ashford on a morning when Edmund was away. She did not knock and wait. She knocked and entered. Lady Ashford was at her writing desk. She looked up at Clara's entrance with the sharp displeasure of a woman who considers her private rooms absolutely inviolable. "I did not invite—" "I know about Mr. Geoffrey Harland," Clara said. Complete silence. The displeasure left Lady Ashford's face, and something considerably more complex took its place. Clara watched it move through her. The shock, the calculation, the fear, and underneath all of it something that looked almost like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who has been holding something for a very long time and has just been told she no longer has the option of holding it privately. "I do not know what you—" 12 years of letters," Clara said quietly. "Delivered to your private rooms. The estate transfer 7 years ago. Edmund found the letters and used them to take everything from you. That is what happened." Lady Ashford said nothing. She sat at her writing desk and looked at Clara, and her face was doing something Clara had never seen it do before. It was losing its structure. Not dramatically, quietly. The way a face loses its structure when the thing holding it up is removed. "You were in love with him, Mr. Harland. You have been in love with him for 12 years, and Edmund found out." Lady Ashford looked at her hands.
Edmund found the letters 7 years ago, Clara said. He told you that if you did not sign your estate portion over to him, he would expose the correspondence publicly, which would have destroyed your reputation and Mr. Harlan's completely. So you signed. A very long silence. He's your son, Clara said, not as an accusation, as a statement of what it cost. Lady Ashford looked up. He is my son, she said, and he used me the same way he uses everyone in this house. Clara sat down across from her. I am going to ask you to do something difficult, Clara said. I am going to ask you to tell me everything you know about Edmund, about his first wife, about the estate, about everything he has done inside this house that has never been put in front of anyone who could act on it. Lady Ashford looked at her steadily. Why? She said. Because I am going to end this, Clara said, and I need everything you know to do it properly. And if I do this, the letters will be returned to you. The estate transfer will be formally challenged on the grounds of coercion. Mr. Harlan's name will never appear in any record of these proceedings. Lady Ashford looked at her for a long time. You are not her, she said quietly. Clara held her gaze. You are not Eleanor, Lady Ashford said. You have never been Eleanor, not for a single day since you walked through that door. Clara said nothing. Lady Ashford looked at her with new eyes, not hostile, something closer to recognition. You are the twin, the one they locked away. Yes, Clara said. Lady Ashford was quiet for a moment. She sent you, she said. She did not have to, Clara said at that. Something moved in Lady Ashford's face. Then she straightened in her chair and folded her hands and began to talk. She talked for 3 hours. What she told Clara about Edmund and about Margaret and about the years inside Harrow Hall was worse than Clara had steeled herself for. It was specific and detailed and witnessed firsthand, and every piece of it had been locked inside Lady Ashford for years because she had been too compromised and too frightened to bring it forward. Margaret had not died of fever. The circumstances of Margaret's death had been managed with the same cold efficiency that Edmund applied to everything. There were people who knew, people who had been paid or frightened into silence. Lady Ashford named them. She named the doctor. She named the estate manager. She named the solicitor who had handled the paperwork. Clara wrote nothing down. She stored everything. When Lady Ashford finished, they sat together in silence for a moment. I should have done this years ago, Lady Ashford said. Yes, Clara said simply. You should have. Lady Ashford looked at her. That is not a kind thing to say. No, Clara said, but it is true, and I think you are done with comfortable untruths. Lady Ashford was quiet. What happens now? She said. Now, Clara said, you write 3 letters. I will tell you exactly what they need to say. 3 letters went out from Harrow Hall that afternoon. The first to a solicitor in London, a specific solicitor whose name Clara had memorized from a document she had read in Ashwood House and stored for exactly the right moment. The second to the estate board, sent under Lady Ashford's name as co-owner of the Harrow estate, formally requesting a review of the estate transfer of 7 years ago on grounds of coercion. Mr. Harlan's name will never appear in any record of these proceedings. Third, to Constance. Not an accusation, not a revelation. A single sentence that Constance had enough information to complete herself. Come Thursday. Bring Beatrice. Come before Edmund returns. Constance and Beatrice arrived on Thursday morning. They came without their husbands. They sat in the morning room with Lady Ashford and Clara and the document that Agnes had quietly placed on the table, a copy of the specific estate records showing what had been taken from Lady Ashford and how. Constance read it in complete silence. Then she looked up. He did this to Mother. Yes, Clara said. He did this to all of us, Beatrice said, quietly, with the particular quality of someone who has been putting language to something they've been feeling for years. Yes, Clara said again. Constance looked at Clara with those sharp eyes. You are not Eleanor. No, Clara said. Where is she? Safe, which is more than she was here. Constance looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the document again. What do you need from us?
Edmund came home on a Friday evening. He came through the front door of Harrow Hall and walked into his entrance hall, and stopped. Something was wrong. He could not immediately identify what. The hall was as it always was. The fire was burning. The footman was at his post. The evening was proceeding on its usual schedule. But something was wrong. He walked to the dining room. Everyone was already seated. This was the first irregularity. Edmund was always the last to be seated at his own table. He had been the last to be seated at his own table for 15 years, because everyone understood that his arrival was the signal for dinner to begin, and nobody sat before the signal. They were all seated. Lady Ashford at her end, Constance and Beatrice side by side, Clara at the head of the table in the Duchess's chair, and at the far end of the table, two men Edmund did not recognize, both formally dressed, both looking at him with the careful, neutral expression of men who are here professionally. Edmund stood in the doorway. "What is this?" he said. Nobody answered immediately. Then Clara set down her glass and looked at him, and Edmund Ashford saw it. Finally, completely. He saw what he had been sensing for 3 weeks and could not locate. The eyes that were the same face as his, but entirely different inside. The stillness that had nothing of Eleanor in it. The way she held herself, not the careful, compressed posture of a woman who has learned to make herself small, the posture of a woman who has been waiting. "You," he said. "Sit down, Edmund," Clara said. "Where is my wife?" "Sit down," Clara said again, quietly, completely without heat. Edmund looked at the two men at the table. One of them spoke. "Mr. Ashford, my name is Hargreaves. I am a solicitor representing the Harrow Estate Board. This is Magistrate Coulson from London. We have been asked to attend this evening by Lady Ashford in her capacity as co-owner of the Harrow Estate." Edmund turned to his mother. Lady Ashford looked at her son. For the first time in 7 years, she looked at him without dropping her eyes. "Mother," Edmund said. His voice had changed, something in it that Clara had not heard before. Not anger, something underneath anger, something that knew. "Sit down, Edmund," Lady Ashford said. He did not sit. He looked around the table, at his mother, at his sisters, at the two strangers, at the woman at the head of his table who was not his wife, and he understood with the complete clarity of a man whose carefully constructed world has just revealed itself as a structure built on things that other people were holding up and now have set down simultaneously. He understood that it was over. He sat down. What followed lasted 4 hours. The solicitor Hargreaves presented the estate transfer documentation and Lady Ashford's formal challenge on grounds of coercion. Edmund listened with the flat, controlled face of a man calculating options and finding each one closed as he reached it. Constance presented her own documented concerns about the management of the family finances since their father's death. Her voice shook on the first sentence and did not shake again after that. Beatrice said less, but what she said was specific and witnessed and could not be dismissed. And then Magistrate Coulson presented a separate matter, the circumstances of Margaret Ashford's death 3 years previously. He presented the names Lady Ashford had given Clara, the doctor, the estate manager, the solicitor. He presented their statements, obtained quietly in the preceding days by a process Clara had set in motion from the letters she had sent. Edmund looked at his mother. "You," he said. "No," Lady Ashford said quietly. "You did this, years ago, to Margaret, to me, to your sisters, to that girl you brought into this house and called a wife." She paused. "I simply stopped helping you hide it." Edmund turned to Clara. His face had the look of a man who is processing multiple devastating things simultaneously and has not yet decided which response is available to him. "Where is she?" he said. "Eleanor is somewhere you will never reach her. She is safe. She is with our father. She is done. She is my wife. She was your wife. That is one of the things that is going to change." Edmund stood up. The magistrate stood up also. Edmund looked at the magistrate. He sat back down.
By the end of the evening, Edmund Ashford had been formally served with notices on 3 separate matters: the estate review, the financial investigation, and the reopening of the inquiry into Margaret's death. He was not arrested that evening. Legal proceedings moved through proper channels, and proper channels took time. But the channels were now open and moving, and he did not have enough reach or resource left to close them, because the people who had previously helped him close them were sitting at the same table that had just turned against him. He left Harrow Hall that evening under an informal arrangement with Magistrate Coulson that restricted his movements pending the formal proceedings. He walked out of his own house without speaking. The front door closed behind him. Clara sat alone in the dining room after everyone had dispersed. The fire had burned low. The candles were down to their last inch. The table was still set. Glasses and plates, and the formal arrangement of a dinner that had served a completely different purpose. Agnes came in quietly to begin clearing. She stopped when she saw Clara still sitting there. "Miss," she began. Then she stopped. She looked at Clara's face. She had been Eleanor's maid for 4 months, and she knew Eleanor's face in every light. This was not Eleanor. "Thank you, Agnes," Clara said, "for everything you did for my sister. Every small thing. I know what it cost to do it quietly." Agnes stood with the plates in her hands and looked at Clara for a moment. "She deserved better," Agnes said simply. "Yes, she did." Agnes began to clear the table. Clara sat a moment longer. Then she went to write to Eleanor. Eleanor came out of Ashwood House 3 weeks later. The formal challenge to Clara's original commitment had been filed by the London solicitor as part of the broader proceedings. The doctor who had signed the papers was found to have a documented professional connection to William Beckett's family. The commitment was ruled invalid. Clara's record was cleared. Both sisters stood outside Ashwood House on a bright, cold morning. Eleanor looked at her twin's face, at 3 years and 4 months of everything it had been through, at what it cost, and what it did. "Tell me everything," Eleanor said. "I will, on the way home." "Did you break anything?" Clara considered this seriously. "I broke the thing that was holding everything else up," she said. "Once that went, the rest came down on its own." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Lady Ashford, at the end, was she?" "She was brave. Late, but brave." "And Constance?" "Braver than she knew she was. Most people are." Eleanor looked at the building behind them, at the small windows, the locked gate, the gray stone walls that held her sister for 3 years. "I am sorry," Eleanor said, "that you had to go in there for me." Clara looked at her. "You went into Harrow Hall for this family. I went into Harrow Hall for you. That is not the same thing as a debt. That is just what we are." Eleanor held her sister's gaze. Then she took Clara's arm. They walked away from Ashwood House together, without looking back.
Edmund Ashford never recovered his position. The estate proceedings lasted 18 months. He lost Harrow Hall in the end, not dramatically, quietly, through the patient work of proper channels that had been opened by people he had spent years assuming would never move against him. The inquiry into Margaret's death was the thing that finished him completely. The truth, when it finally came out, was worse than the whispers had been. It usually is. Lady Ashford reclaimed her estate portion. She retired to a small house in Bath. Whether she ever saw Mr. Geoffrey Harland again is not recorded. Some things belong only to the people they concern. Constance found her courage and kept it. It changed her marriage. It changed her entirely. Beatrice followed her sister's lead the way she had always followed her sister's lead, only this time in a worthwhile direction. Eleanor Voss was granted an annulment on grounds that required very little argument given what the proceedings had surfaced. She went home to her father. She sat with him in the garden on the first evening, and he held her hand and said nothing, because nothing was what was needed. She recovered slowly, on her own terms, in her own time, the way genuine recovery always works. Clara Voss was never locked away again, not because the world became kinder, not because the people who had put her there were held fully accountable. They were not entirely. That is the truth of how justice works in the real world. Imperfect, incomplete, but present.
Clara was never locked away again because she had spent 3 years learning something that William Beckett and Edmund Ashford and every system that had ever worked against her had not anticipated. That the most dangerous woman in any room is not the loudest one. It is the one who has learned to be quiet and patient and absolutely certain. And that woman was never going back inside anyone's walls again. If Clara's story gave you chills, if Eleanor's strength moved you, if this is the kind of storytelling you have been looking for, then you are exactly where you belong. This is Duke and Duchess, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told, slowly, completely, and with nothing left out. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.